Okay, tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Uli Schamiloglu. He is a professor of German, Nordic, and Slavic. He's, for this whole year, a visiting professor in Kazakhstan, but he's home for the holidays, and he agreed to give this talk way back in September, I think. So I really appreciate that you would work this in while you're home for the holidays. You know, my dad was a high school history teacher, and I ended up studying virology and microbiology. This is a really big sweet spot for me because, you know, 1347 and all that, it's an amazing thing. To read more about it, you realize, it wasn't just those dates. It's a lot of other dates. It's a pandemic that burnt through Europe over many centuries. It's still with us today in parts of North America and Central Eurasia. So I'm really looking forward to this one. And he's going to be talking to us about recent advances in the study of Black Death in Central Eurasia. Please join me in welcoming Uli Schamiloglu to Wednesday night at the lab.
Thank you very much, Tom. Can everybody hear me well? Yes. Okay, thank you. So thanks, Tom, for your very, very kind invitation. I must admit I haven't attended one of these before, but I've seen it on Wisconsin Public Television many, many times. And I find them to be a very, very fascinating series of programs. So it's really, really great to be able to be here. And who knows, maybe 100 years from now, they'll still be showing it on TV. That's, you know, living on and on and on. So, yes, so this year I'm in Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, and there, apparently 2 years ago, it got as cold as 50 below zero Celsius. So I haven't experienced that yet, but zero feels good these days. So I'd like to talk about one of the areas that is not my area of study in terms of my training, but an area that I kind of moved into once I realized how important it is. So in some ways, I'm going to be talking about lab science as a historian who knows very little about lab science, except that my brother does it, but he's not at this university. And I also, so I really want to emphasize the fact that in some ways I'm speaking as an amateur, but an amateur who's in awe of the science that goes into the study of this particular topic, and in addition, how important it is. So before I introduce the topic of bubonic plague, I just want to, for the sake of truth and advertising, just say a little bit about what it is that I really do in terms of my training and in terms of the kind of teaching and research I do when I'm not working on the history of Yersinia pestis. So I am a specialist in historical and modern Turkic languages, and just so that you see, Turkic-speaking peoples live, the oldest inscriptions are from Mongolia, and you have people in South Siberia. My own ancestry is from the Middle Volga region. My father grew up in Chelyabinsk, which is in Siberia. I'm teaching there now. Here you have Turkey, parts of Iran, Central Asia, and then you have the Yakut up there who are reindeer breeders. Yeah. And so one of the things that I did was study Turkic and all kinds of other languages as an undergraduate and as a graduate. If I have to choose one area of scholarly focus, it's the political and social economic history of Central Eurasia, especially the western part in the 13th, 14th centuries. There's a state called the Golden Horde that will come up in the course of my presentation. So I'm kind of sort of specialized in that, but I really do have very, very broad interests. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in front of you. So some of the other kinds of things I'm interested in is the intellectual currents among the Muslim Turkic peoples of the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, be it questions of modernity or religious and curricular reforms and new imagined communities, nationalism, etc. And I also have various kinds of specialized topics that I work on. And one of them is the history of disease, mostly Yersinia pestis. I don't really get into the other kinds of diseases, though I know that other diseases like smallpox existed and that cattle had things called rinderpest and so on. history of climate is something that I'm getting increasingly more interested in. That will also have a small supporting role in tonight's talk. I'm interested in the Columbian Exchange, all kinds of fun stuff, the stuff that, rather than sitting in an archive and doing, going through thousands or millions of pages of archival material. Anyway, I don't have that kind of material available to me. But rather than doing that, I do the fun stuff that nobody else does in my field. So the first part is plague. So let me just say one or two words about it, or a couple of sentences about it, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with it. And I'll start with the level of understanding that I would have written 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or what I would say for undergraduates. For undergraduate lectures, this is a great topic. So basically, there's a bacillus, Yersinia pestis, which would be found inside the body of, let's say, a rat. And you would have a flea that would bite suck blood from the rat, and then would somehow come to you and suck your blood. Once it is doing that, it would somehow get blocked because of the bacillus and regurgitate into you. And so then you would get sick with bubonic plague. Your buboes or your lymph nodes could swell up and turn black, be the size of grapefruit and so on. You could have all kinds of things happen, including delirium, high fever, suddenly dropping dead. If it gets into your bloodstream, your death is assured. And there's different kinds, the kind that would be spread just through the bite of the flea. Or I sneeze, I actually have pneumonic plague, and then tomorrow you're all dead. So there are these various kinds of variations. Now, that would be kind of a classic, simple way of talking about it. And if you're giving a talk to undergraduates, you can elaborate and really try to gross them out. So it's great material. But that level of understanding, I think, which was, let's say, classic 20 years ago, when some people were beginning to write about the Middle East, so for example, Michael Doles, or later I started writing about this for Central Asia about 30 or 25 years ago, you could get away with saying that. And what I'd like to share with you tonight is a little bit of the kinds of things that have been coming up since within the last 10 years or within the last several years or even within recent months that's really totally changing what it means to be writing about the history of bubonic plague anywhere, but also for Central Eurasia. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about are these new approaches, and part of it is kind of a 30,000 feet overview of some of the kinds of research I've done. And it all makes sense. It all fits within what people do for Europe and now the Middle East. People in my field tend to think I'm crazy, but they're wrong, and it's okay. So modern plague, so we have like several historical pandemics. There is the modern plague, there's the Black Death and its aftermath from the mid-14th century on, and then later on I'll talk about the plague in the time of Justinian as well, and hopefully I can stick to about 50 to 55 minutes. So, and I'm not going to be focusing in detail on any region. If you're interested in reading about names and dates and figures and sources, you can look up some of my articles on my page on academia.edu, or you can contact me and I'd be happy to give you some information for looking up things. So, in general, I'm trying to talk about Central Eurasia, or about those issues that affect Central Eurasia and how and why. But actually, even for modern plague, which began in the late 19th century, it affected parts of Russia, it affected Kazakhstan, for example, and all kinds of other areas. But people haven't studied it that much. I was very surprised at a conference a few years ago that there was actually a woman from the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow who presented a paper on how people were dealing with bubonic plague in late 19th, early 20th century Kazakhstan. They thought that somehow you treat it the way you treat smallpox or cholera or other things. And then I went up to her afterwards and I introduced myself, and I said, "Oh, I'm interested in the history of plague in the same part of the world, but for other periods." And she looked at me, and I wasn't sure if she thought there was something wrong with me. It was like, how quaint that anybody would even think of studying something. So there's even a huge disconnect between the body of literature for medieval plague and ancient plague and even earlier things, and the study of even the modern plague of the 19th century on. And there's not that much I'm going to be saying about it, I think, except for a couple of slides. And so Lester Little, who is a professor emeritus at Smith College, did a very, very nice review article. I'll have it up in a second. And so just citing him, he's in the next slide. So basically, people talk about a new era in plague research, beginning with the outbreak of plague in Hong Kong. And so, you read about it reaching Honolulu, San Francisco, all kinds of other things. Recently, because of a conference, I was rereading Albert Camus' The Plague, and so, about the history of plague in Oran, in Algeria, and so on. So it's really in a lot of places. But so basically, the outbreak in Hong Kong in 1894 set off a race between Louis Pasteur in Paris and Robert Koch in Berlin. And I didn't know about Koch before reading this article. So apparently he's known mainly to medical students for his postulates stating the conditions for proving that a given parasite or microorganism directly causes a given disease. And the three things have to do with isolating it and growing it in a culture, etc. And so it's in this year that you had Shibasaburo Kitasato, who worked with Koch, claiming that he identified the pathogen that was responsible for plague. Later on, his work was discredited because they thought his study was flawed. But Alexander Yersin, a Swiss-born French citizen who had abandoned a promising career in Paris, went to serve as a medical officer in Indochina. And so he also, several days later, announced the discovery of the pathogen. And so his name is associated now with the pathogen, and so now we call it Yersinia pestis. They used to call it Pastorella pestis. So basically, 1894 was important because this was the beginning of the modern ability or practice of identifying the pathogen. And so, but we have a new era in plague research going back to 2010. And so this is discussed in Lester Little's article, Plague Historians and Lab Coats, which was published in Past and Present. And I just thought that since this is Wednesday night at the lab, it's a really, really good title to share with you if you're interested in the history of the study of modern plague. It's a lovely, readable article. But he is one of the, earlier persons to put the new style research in a kind of historical context. And he says, though, he's pointing out that the very, very first study from 2010 by Morelli and others, so that was the first that actually tried to do analysis of the DNA of Yersinia pestis. And since then, there's been a huge explosion in the study of the history of Yersinia pestis, not just in terms of historical sources, but in terms of digging up skeletons, using dental pulp, identifying DNA, amplifying it. And so there's a whole thing of DNA and what aDNA is, where they kind of try to replicate it and make it studyable in a certain way. I'm not quite sure about the technology there because that's not what I do in my day job. But so there's a huge amount of research, and now there's again competition in the areas that I study. Now you have a race between Tübingen and labs in Tübingen and I think in Hamilton, Ontario, for trying to identify samples that might have DNA in it from plague burial sites throughout Eurasia and in Europe. So we have a new kind of race going on. The next slide is from something that I've used that I'll come back to from 2013 by Cui and et al., Historical Variations in Mutation Rate in Epidemic Pathogen, Yersinia pestis. So now, what we have is a couple of things. So first of all, based upon collections of blood samples from East Asia, Cui and others and his team have identified, different strains of Yersinia pestis. They're saying that the center of it is localized here, and so there's what they call the Silk Road and the Horse and Tea Road. And actually, when I try to look up the Horse and Tea Road, I can't find very much information about it. But the Silk Road I've heard about. I've talked about it in terms of the network of trade roads. But so they're saying this localized area, which is at the connection of, let's just say, various kinds of trade routes, is the area where they say you have the oldest original specimens and kind of the greatest variation in the strains of Yersinia pestis. And so basically this is Tibet and the Qinghai Plateau. So based solely on DNA research, not on historical sources, not on written sources. So one, you have an international group of scientists saying that the original ground zero for plague is Tibet or the Qinghai Plateau. The second thing that they do here, and please don't ask me how they got this, but so they have these things here where they're looking at different branches based upon the various samples, and they're going back to the moments where you've got the various kinds of breaking off into branches, which is a word that they're calling a polytomy or polytomy, maybe, probably polytomy. But so you've got these various points. And so one of them, and I don't remember which of these nodes, maybe this one, would be associated more or less with the eruption of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. And the earlier one, and I don't remember if it's this one, is associated with the eruption of the plague in the time of Justinian, to which I'll get in a few moments or later on over the course of this hour. So for me, this, plus certain other things, is absolutely revolutionary, because you may be aware that the Black Death spread from Kaffa in the Crimea via Constantinople to Alexandria and Sicily, and from there to Europe. That's the classic presentation. And that, people don't really know where it came from or how it got to Kaffa in the Crimea. I actually have some articles where I've talked about it, and I've looked at the historical sources, and maybe I've done that more in depth than anybody else. But even then, it's fragmentary information. So a lot of it, in terms of what I do as a historian with written sources, is trying to collect and interpret fragmentary sources in a different kind of framework. Now, there's one of the things I promised to talk about were some of the kinds of recent advances. And so there's a certain range of new issues that historians interested in this have to deal with as well. And one of them is, why does plague spread? And so scholars are trying to attempt to create a new synthesis of the relationship between climate and climate change, including sometimes rainy periods, and trying to figure out how that's related to the spread of bubonic plague or also other diseases. And so let's say if you've got communities of rodents that are reservoirs for the disease, and then, does the climate change, or let's say the rainy period, force them out of their traditional burrows, put them into closer proximity to human beings? Is that the right mechanism? Are there other mechanisms? So this is something that now people are beginning to raise and trying to see what exactly the relationship is between those two separate subjects, and what the interaction is, and how do you explain it. And a book published just a few months ago by Bruce Campbell, The Great Transition, Climate, Disease, and Society in the Late Medieval World, is trying to deal with that. This is kind of the first major synthesis. I have it sitting on my desk in Astana, Kazakhstan. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I've been hearing that this is supposed to be a really important book. But this is just one book, and of course books take a while to produce. There's a rapidly growing body of research, usually in the form of articles dealing with this. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the question of the rats, and so stepping back, people are saying, okay, what rodents spread plague? Now, we have to remember, or I have been reminded by colleagues, that bubonic plague is not a human disease. It is a rodent disease. So it's really important to examine the communities of rodents that harbor that bacillus. Because of mutations over time, some of us believe in evolution, obviously. Plagues, you know, just like the flu evolves every year. So there's regular mutation of the bacillus. And sometimes it becomes more deadly, sometimes it's less deadly. There may be other kinds of factors involved as well. And so if the bacillus is present in a community and it doesn't kill all of them, and you have it, you know, some of them getting sick and the bacillus staying kind of alive and being maintained, so then you've got this kind of reservoir. And so, you know, people generally talk about rats, right? Certainly in terms of Europe, in terms of Byzantium, in terms of all kinds of places as well. But you have other kinds of rodents, such as, you know, marmots in the southern Altai region. And so if you know something about the history of the Mongol world empire, you're aware that Mongols might have gone around, sometimes digging them up, maybe eating them. There's also ground squirrels. Recently, there was a question of gerbils. There was a small kerfuffle in some blog posts and some articles about understanding and misunderstanding about whether gerbils were a really main factor in the importing of introduction of bubonic plague into Europe. I never would have occurred to me that gerbils were a major factor in the spread of plague. But so the argument against that being like a really, really major factor is that gerbils don't normally come into contact with human beings unless, you know, your kid has a gerbil pet or something, but chances are it's not been exposed to bubonic plague. Now, in trying to get some background information for an article that I'm writing about Albert Camus and the plague, not as a literary work and allegory about Vichy France, but as, you know, what about the biology, or what about the actual stuff that he writes about in terms of the disease. So I was reading stuff from the Center for Disease Control that was talking about cats and dogs. And, you know, I mean, plague is present in this country as well. You know, you can have people in Utah or other places, New Mexico, getting sick. Sometimes cats may pick it up when dealing with rodents or rats and so on, or dogs and others. And so, you know, those are animals that can also be involved. But in terms of the classic description of how it's spread, you know, you don't see that kind of thing there. So the bottom line is that plague is a rodent disease, not a human disease, but it can spread to humans when there is contact. Sometimes under normal circumstances you don't have contact. Sometimes there's a disruption in the ecosystem because of, you know, change in weather patterns related to climate change, or there can be disruption for other reasons as well. Maybe there was some kind of flooding or something in a river and they move out and so on. So the other thing, there's the question of the human vector. So normally one talks about fleas, and so rats have fleas. Actually, humans have their own fleas as well. And so according to Michelle Ziegler, who's one of the persons who writes about this, she has a very, very good blog called Contagions, where I'm actually going to refer to it several times. So she points out that you have really 5 infected potential human vectors possibly involved in a wide distribution of human plague cases. So you have the rat flea. And so as I was putting this together, because I hadn't put connected some of the dots too. So I was thinking about cats, and I noticed today that she said, yes, cat fleas are important too. So you have the human fleas, but you also have 2 kinds of human lice. And so recently there have been studies where people are trying to figure out to what extent lice is involved in the spreading of bubonic plague. And I should really say, until I read that, and I've been working on this a little bit as an amateur for 30 years, I didn't realize that lice can be involved in spreading it as well. And so obviously people have had lice for a long time, and so now they're trying to figure out to what extent lice has been a factor in the spread of plague during the earlier 2 pandemics. So the second of the 2 major pandemics is the Black Death from the mid-14th century on. And I'm a little bit confused, because when people say the Black Death, do they really mean like 1347 to 1352? What about in the 1400s and the 1500s, and some of the material that Tom sent around, he's referring to later plague in London, 17th century, and so on. There's really no terminus date, final date for the end of the second pandemic. 1700, 1750, it wasn't around for 100 or 150 years. Then it starts up again in the 19th century, probably because of new mutations. So it's not clear-cut in the same way. Now, so I just have a few images here. These are maps that are easily available on the internet. In some ways, they can be misleading. So you see here, this is only referring to like that 5-year period. So this color is like 1347 you see coming from Asia. And so then you see 1348 about how it's spread, 1349, 1350 up here, and areas that are relatively unaffected. And so this is not, I don't have the time to go into extended discussion of the various results of plague, but it'll emerge from some of the things that I'm going to mention. I should say that these are some of the kind of traditional ways of thinking about it, and now that you have DNA studies being used, people are raising totally unexpected new questions about these kinds of discussions related to the path of the Black Death. This is another one thinking of representing, the spread in that same period. You have a couple of famous maps. This is the Tignor or Tignor map, and it's showing spread from Asia. But this one was done quite some time ago, and it really is not based. For example, when they show the spread through South Asia and so on, like my colleagues like Andre Wink here in the history department, we've talked about whether there's any documentary evidence for plague in India, medieval India, and he says no, there isn't any, so he doesn't believe that it visited India. But you have maps showing all these kinds of transmission routes, and I have no idea what data it might be based on. There's another one here doing some of the same stuff, and it's pointing out Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan next to Kazakhstan. I'll be referring to that as well, and I'm not quite sure what they're basing it on, but I know what I base some of my views on. Okay, so all right, so in terms of Central Eurasia, what are some of the, this is just a one-page, one-slide summary of some of the kinds of effects that I try to document, and by documenting, I don't mean that I have the kinds of sources available to me, at the level that a historian of medieval Europe would have. What I do is I say, okay, I am pretty confident that the plague went through these territories. What can I see, rather than perhaps the direct evidence, more like the indirect evidence at times? So the kinds of things that I see, or that I think I see, include political disruption. So I think you have from like 1358, 1360 on, you have the total collapse of centralized political authority in the Golden Horde. And then in the middle of the 14th century, you see the collapse of Mongol rule in China, in Central Asia, in Iran, and in the Golden Horde territories. I see evidence for depopulation, and we have migration, I can tell, into newly depopulated areas, and I'll show a map of that in a minute. It's not going to be a major map, but it'll be a map. I see the decline in urban centers in that region, and in also a decline in sedentary agricultural population. For the Golden Horde territories in this period, I don't have descriptions of, let's say, fields laying fallow and animals going untended, but you do have that for other parts in the Middle East, more towards the Middle East and Anatolia, where you have discussion of unharvested fields and so on. But in the Golden Horde territories, what happens is with the decline of centralized authority and the decline of urban centers, you see the rise in the importance of nomadic confederations. And I think the explanation for that is that nomads are epidemiologically less likely to be exposed to disease. Once they're exposed, of course, they may succumb to it, but they may not be exposed to it or they may not suffer from it as readily. So in the case of the Black Death, there's the famous example of, let's say, 67 out of 69 monks in Avignon dying from plague in one place at one time. And I think that the Golden Horde capital city of Sarai, there were actually two of them, but whichever one it is, in Sarai, that was visited by Ibn Battuta, talks about all the mosques and the madrasas and so on that were there, how large the population of the city was. They were probably all living fairly close to one another, and they probably suffered very, very greatly from it, because later on travelers would only talk more or less about the ruins of that city. So there's cultural and technological regression, decline in the number of tombstones, for example, and the sudden ceasing to exist of emerging Turkic literary languages. Instead, later on, you get new vernacular-based literary languages. We need to remind ourselves that, so 14th century, not only was that the time of Chaucer in England, that Boccaccio was writing his Decameron as they were fleeing plague in Florence. So, I try to look for examples of parallels. You have, in the case of the Golden Horde, you have, instead of the traditional min sites, suddenly you have new min sites such as Gülistan, which is the rose garden. It's also the name of a famous Persian work, which was translated into the local Turkic language as well. But I think, if you suddenly have these new mint sites that are not connected with the traditional urban centers, is it people fleeing plague at the same time? Other things are economic consequences. Because of the scarcity of labor, you have inflation. So I think we can document that through the change in the weight of coinage in this time. I can't document the rise directly in the price of labor, but there are these kinds of things as well. And so the final thing that I try to find, and I think I see some evidence for, maybe not in the Golden Horde territories, but in the neighboring territories of the future Ottoman Empire, but also in the Golden Horde territories, examples of increased morbidity, fascination with death, and increased religiosity, which might be reflected through certain literary works or through the establishment of mosques. Now, I'll just really quickly, so I'd just like you to consider that in its rise in the first half of the 13th century, we should remember that Chinggis Khan died in 1227, you suddenly have, by the time you get to Kublai and the Yuan dynasty established by 1294, you've got a single empire going over, let's say, China, Central Asia, Iran, the Golden Horde. They could have kept on going into Eastern Europe, but they had to turn around. This is a really terrible map, but so the Golden Horde, what people talk about the Golden Horde territories would be more or less like this part. Here you had the Russian principalities that were subject to it. Here you've got like the Black Sea. Kefa is there in the Crimea. The areas north of the Caspian Sea. Along the Volga River you had originally Old Sarai and then later on New Sarai, early like around 1300 and so on. So this is a vast territory all the way from the pass at Lake Zaisan all the way going out to the west. But then what happened? Then what happens? Let's say in the 1430s on until the conquest of the Khanate of Kazan in 1552, you have a relatively small Khanate in the south. Okay, here's the Black Sea, Sea of Azov, Crimean Khanate here, a small Khanate around Kazan over here. You have a small Khanate around Astrakhan. There's another one here that's not shown, Kasimov, and then you've got around Tumen. So basically what you see is instead of like a state controlling this vast territory, you've got these many states. And I think you could argue that the reason for that is that you have such a level of depopulation that you don't have the manpower to control such a large state. On the other hand, on the side of Muscovy, you've got, during the time of Ivan III in the late 15th century, you have the gathering of the Russian lands. Probably there too you have depopulation, but rather than having this kind of weakening of a state, because in the Mongol world empire, genealogy had a lot to do with your place of success, your order of succession, whereas on the Russian side, it was based on estates or patrimonies, and one ruler could just keep gathering more and more land. Now, I probably shouldn't keep going at this pace, so I'm just going to start skipping ahead really fast. But so I pointed out Lake Issykul in like Kyrgyzstan, right near Kazakhstan. Around there in the 13th century, you had a Christian Turkic community that was writing inscriptions using the Syriac alphabet. And so these are known as the Syriac Turkic inscriptions, and this is an example of one of them. And so those are inscriptions that ceased to exist, be written like around in the 1340s. There was a certain number like around 1339, 1341, a sudden spike, and then more or less it almost ceases to be written. And in the Middle Volga region, you also have the Volga-Bulgarian inscriptions. You have Muslim inscriptions there in Turkic languages for quite some time, but after 1358 or after 1360, the main kind in one specific language called Volga-Bulgarian, which is closely related to modern Chuvash, not exactly the same, but it's related. It's a very aberrant kind of Turkic language. Suddenly, it ceases to exist, and I think that it's because of the waves of plague that we're pretty sure about for like 1360, 1364 in that region, probably wiped out the population that was using that language. This is, scientists or social scientists like to talk about high N. I do low N because I just have a very, very small number of inscriptions. So you see here, it's not clear, could there have been an earlier wave of plague here that's not documented? But we see here, like around 1358, 1360, a spike again, and then it ends. It's really so low end that it's pathetic, but that's what I have. And in terms of religiosity, there's all kinds of works that are written in the 14th century before the time of plague. Then, during the time of plague, there's one specific work that's about how to get to heaven. It's a handbook of Islam. And so I think that one of the copies is from 1358, and then another copy is like 1360, and that's the death of the author. So I think it's connected to waves of plague that are going on in that time. And so just even the notion that you're asking, so what can I do in order to get to heaven? This is parallel to what you're seeing in medieval Europe. In terms of morbidity, in terms of fear of punishment from God, and so on. So in Central Asia, you have some similar phenomena. So you've got the local literary languages that are an archaic tradition that cease to exist. And then when you have the famous poet Alişir Navai, and he's putting together kind of like this new version of the Central Asian Turkic literary language, which seems to come out of nowhere, I think, as is indicated in some sources from the period, that it's another example of a vernacular-based language, and that's the really short version. You also have the Mirajname. So you've got some works that are talking about the ascent, the night ascent of the Prophet Muhammad to heaven, and one colleague has taken some of my theories and says that this kind of manuscript illustrations are kind of supposed to be a visual way of teaching about Islam, again, during a period of increased religiosity. I'll skip about the changes in language. In the case of the Ottoman Empire or Anatolia at this same time, there's another work that I work on, the Mevlid, or the poem that's recited to honor the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, and that has a long tradition. I won't go into it. And so around 1411 or so, you've got the beginning of a Turkish tradition, which later becomes very, very popular. But so basically, the Turkish tradition, in addition to being very beautiful, simple, based upon the vernacular, has sections on not just the birth or the ascension of the night ascension of the Prophet and his attributes, but it includes the death of the Prophet Muhammad, a final petition for repentance and forgiveness, and what else? yeah, so it includes, so basically the death. And so this is an innovation compared to the Arabic language tradition, where it just really ends with the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. So why is it that they're talking about the death and so on? And if one of the famous lines in it is, if you seek salvation from fire, say your prayers. And so could fire be a metaphor for bubonic plague or something else? I'm not sure, but these are questions that certainly have not been raised. It becomes a wildly popular celebration later on in the Ottoman Empire, but I don't have time to go into that. One really, really interesting new thing about it too, is a question in terms of these new approaches and new insights that we have is, there's the question of, did Yersinia pestis mutate? And of course it did. That's, you know, that Sway article that I showed was based upon the study of the rate of mutation. That was one of the pillars for understanding what was going on there. And so, but as the bacillus mutates, does it become more toxic, or virulent is another word that people use, but let's say more likely to cause sudden death? And that seems possibly to be the case. If anybody is interested in these kinds of things, in the blog Contagions, you have a discussion between Monica Green and Boris Schmidt on plague phylogeny, where they're talking about the various ways of thinking about it. One of the things is that you've had some recent, in the last several years, or even just this year, you've had some like YouTube or video presentations of a lecture that was recorded and posted online by Kraus, who heads the lab in Tübingen. You have articles by Spiro and others from 2016 and others that are talking about these kinds of recent mutations. And so so this is not settled. The dust is still in the air. But so one of the possibilities that people are talking about, or one of the likely scenarios, is that after arriving from Asia, Yersinia pestis may have mutated in Europe. A new strain would have developed in Europe. There's the claim based upon DNA from 17th century plague burials in London that it might have mutated in London. There's other people who are wondering whether it might have mutated elsewhere. So, and once that mutation took place, there's the question about whether, instead of having multiple waves of plague coming from East Asia or Inner Asia into Europe, did you have a new strain develop in Western Europe, which then created a reservoir? And then you have it going back, recycling to the Middle Volga region, the region of Bulgaria. Well, okay, it's always a bad idea to do this. I just got caught here doing this. Yeah. Did you have it go, a new strain developing in Western Europe and then coming back to Bulgar? And exactly in the city of Bulgar, where you had these Volga-Bulgarian inscriptions, this year in April they announced that there was a new strain that developed there that was kind of an advancement built upon the strain mutation that took place in London. We had no idea about any of this stuff a year ago. So within the last year, there's the whole notion of the development of new strains, the development of a reservoir here, and then of it coming back here, mutating here, and then there's talk about a whole new plague reservoir that would have developed over there. So that's totally revolutionary for thinking about plague in Central Eurasia. Now, I will try to finish by 8 o'clock, and so if I have to, I'll hop, skip, and jump some more. But the third part of my presentation is about the first historical pandemic, and that's the plague in the time of Justinian, which is from the mid-6th century until the mid-8th century. And so, once again, going back to this slide that I showed earlier, it's based upon this that people can say, first of all, that yes, there was something happened to plague in this earlier period, but were those pandemics that you read about in German sources or Roman sources from this period, can we really say that that was Yersinia pestis that was responsible for all of these deaths. But you've had since the plague in the time of Justinian going across North Africa. It was very, very causing high mortality throughout Europe, Ireland, Scandinavia, and so on. But people have studied it much, much less than the Black Death. So it's also possible you never even heard of it, but it's as important, perhaps even more important than the Black Death in world history. But it's, again, based upon DNA research that it's now been established through burials, through DNA found in burials in Aschheim in Germany, that yes, it is indeed Yersinia pestis. So now we can kind of come to it from various angles and say, yes, basically, the plague in the time of Justinian that we have in Europe, is the same bacillus that we had later, and it's the same thing that's connected to what was going on in East Asia. So there's a whole lot of hypotheses or theories that I have for trying to figure out evidence or indirect evidence for the kinds of phenomena for the 6th to 8th century that we saw earlier for the 14th century and for the 15th century. So, and I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but just throw it out there for you to think about. So from like 552 on, you've got suddenly this huge empire going across Eurasia from Mongolia as far as the Black Sea and so on, the Turkic Empire. That suddenly splits. We don't really know why. Historians talk about certain parts of Eurasia being emptied out of population, like the emptying out of Bulgaria. Later on, you have other groups coming into Eastern Europe. You have the Avars coming in at a certain point. Later on, you have the Bulgar Turks going there and establishing a state. They later Slavify. So basically, I wonder whether the Turk Empire could have expanded so rapidly in the middle of the 6th century exactly because of the depopulation of of large portions. So I think we can talk about depopulation of urban centers. The sources for Constantinople talk about huge amounts of death there. Medievalists talk about unharvested fields in Middle East and in Europe. When you have kind of, instead of a regular, you get things that more like tax farming rather than the state or in Byzantium organizing all of the military units. It becomes kind of decentralized. That could be a response to depopulation. And so a lot of this gets pretty technical, and I think I'm not going to keep talking about it. But so even in terms of, if you read about the history of Byzantium in this period, you see that the 6th, the 7th, 8th century, it's seen as this kind of dark period in Byzantine history. A lot of things are not clear. There's kind of they talk about the decline in Byzantine literature, but that just may be because so many people were dying. In the case of Central Eurasia specifically, you may be familiar that there was a medieval Iranian language, Sogdian, which was used. I think we can speak about the decline of Sogdian. I think we can talk about the decline of Iranian populations in Central Asia, which is why it was so easy for Turkic populations to move in. The earliest Turkic literary language was inscriptions of the early 8th century. In the immediately preceding decades, everybody was using Sogdian as a lingua franca. Why is it that changed? So I think we can connect it to that, and I'm working on that. There are some hints of evidence for being able to talk about inflation in this period based upon changes in the way of coinage. Definitely, there may be evidence to discuss increased morbidity and religiosity. So I didn't talk about it here, but there was the ways in which the sign of the cross was used among some of the Turk population, and it also could have been they could have been putting crosses on their forehead in black in order to ward off disease. So that's a possibility. The 760s was a period in Inner Asia of a number of groups that were converting to major world religions, such as the Uyghurs converting to Manichaeism in the 760s. You had the Khazars accepting Judaism, others converting to Islam. And there's a whole burst of monastery construction in the 760s that defies explanation. So, basically the bottom line for that is that we don't have a huge amount of information, detailed information in our hands. We see a huge amount of increase in religiosity. We see in Eurasia the translation of all kinds of Buddhist literature, the beginning of the translation of all kinds of Buddhist literature into dozens of languages using dozens of alphabets. And if you ask why, normally you wouldn't find an explanation. But my suggestion would be that people were really concerned about trying to be better human beings, or to be better Muslims, or to be better Buddhists, or whatever, and that explains why they were copying texts as kind of devotional acts. And also in terms of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, that goes back to this period. So I think that there's an awful lot of research that needs to be done in terms of studying, for example, Tibetan iconography. Is there kind of a growth in the depiction of death and so on? Is there an increase in morbidity in art in this period? I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think this is something that the people who specialize in that have asked. Now, I hope my last slide, yes, this is my last slide, is I'd like to introduce a new term for you, paleopathology. You also have paleoepidemiology and terms like that. So I don't have a reference for you, but these labs in Tübingen and at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and some of these other Max Planck institutes in Germany are interested in reconstructing the history of disease going back thousands of years, not just to the 6th to the 8th centuries, but going back to 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. And so there's a strong interest in working with archaeologists to try to find samples of DNA going back thousands of years. And we even have, I believe, people on the UW-Madison campus in archaeology working in some kinds of projects like that. I've seen announcements of it. And so probably in the coming years, there's going to be new findings that explain not just the fact that Yersinia pestis changed in a way around the middle of the 6th century that made it a profoundly more potent pathogen, but that Yersinia pestis itself broke away from tuberculosis at some point, and you have earlier versions of these pathogens that didn't have the same range of effects, but had some of the other more limited effects that might have been more specifically related to certain animals and not others. And in the past week or two, I've seen some news items. I wasn't able to find them for tonight, but it does seem to be the case that in the future, people are going to be talking about, let's say, I'm kind of just trying to remember what I read, but let's say between 3,500 BCE to 3,000 BCE or something. People, I've seen the beginning of statements talking about how, even that far ago, that long ago, that you had these DNA samples of Yersinia pestis or its antecedent isolated in burial sites. And the assumption is that, these people would have suffered from plague or from its antecedent and would have died from it. And now people are trying to figure out, okay, what are the animals that are responsible for the spread? What are the humans that are responsible maybe for spread? What was the interaction between them? So probably this is a topic that's going to continue to be very exciting, with all kinds of new and unexpected results in the coming years as well. So thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Yes, please, Tom. Oh, okay. Yeah. He was being kind. He let you take the question first.
So the story of the transference from Kappa, and then
that's really the only story that people generally talk about. There's a source, de Musis, who writes about that. That's, you have this one source talking about the Mongols throwing the bodies over the walls, and that's supposed to be the first recorded example of biological warfare and so on, and that's accepted. I've written about, the sources that talk about the plague reaching Constantinople, and so, that is an important kind of middle ground there where you can also document that all kinds of things were happening. So I don't think that that's controversial. Yes, Tom?
You mentioned that Yersinia is closely related to TB. What role, if any, did plague have in North America when the Europeans came over? Smallpox was a big deal, TB was a big deal, but I've never heard plague as being one of the major diseases that attacked Native Americans. Did that happen and I just didn't hear about it, or did it not happen, or it's not your area?
I have never read anything about that. On the other hand, it's endemic, right? So I mean, in the Southwest and so on, so it seems that you have a permanent reservoir. The question then would be, when did it arrive? I'm not sure that I know.
Right.
I mean, let's put it this way. If I had to make a guess, it would be that it's based upon modern plague. So it would have been like after Hong Kong and so on. And as I'm answering, as my mouth is moving, I think it's possible that I actually read that is the case. That like in the modern Soviet Union, and I think probably in the Americas, all of those are descended like from the current strains are descended from modern plague.
And that'd be 1890 at Hong Kong?
94, I don't remember if that's the earliest one, but that was the one that kind of sparked off the race between the biologists.
Okay. Then another question, not to go all Jared Diamond on you, but your maps show a lot of east-west, east-west, east-west. What do we know, if anything, about north-south, north into Scandinavia, south into Africa?
This is what I would say, that people, kind of romanticize what they call the Silk Road, which is just a network of trade routes, in trying to look at the sources for the plague in the time of Justinian. I wondered whether it didn't go down to maybe the Arabian Sea, and from there, because basically they say it arrived in Egypt from Pelusium, and so they're not quite sure where it is, but let's say in a southern area, and there's the belief that it might have been like through the Gulf of Aden and so on. So for the 14th century, yes, we can talk about it going from, let's say, Tibet, Lake Issyk-Kul, to Kaffa, to Constantinople and down into the Mediterranean. But I would not insist that was the route of transmission for the first outbreak of the plague in the time of Justinian, for example. And in the case of Hong Kong, if the outbreak starts there, I'm not 100% sure about the chronology of it. Again, that's different from going across Kazakhstan and Russia and from there to the rest of the world. Yes, David.
I'm reminded by the topic tonight of a book that was recommended to me by a history teacher in Beirut who was my patient, and it's called Rats, Lice, and History.
Yes.
It was written probably 80 years ago, I think the middle 1930s, by a man by the name of Zinzer, and most medical students in my area learned their microbiology from his textbook of microbiology. But he has a wonderful book that talks about the effects of various diseases on the course of history and so forth, which you are exploring here. So I think people would find that an interest. As old as it is, I think it still has a lot of very current information, just not bringing it up to date with all the DNA stuff now that can
You're absolutely right, so thank you for that. My first introduction to this whole topic was reading William McNeill's Plagues and Peoples as a graduate student or afterwards, and that's when I saw he gave he had one paragraph where he suggested that the Mongol world empire was connected to this whole process, and I kind of took it from there. And so let's put it this way, with the amount of new research coming out, it's so difficult to stay on top of things. I don't stay on top of things. I just get what falls off the wagon from what other people are doing, or if people write review articles where they review what the latest is. But it's so difficult to keep up with the amount of material. Like every year there's a number of important new studies. So in my own case, I probably won't go back to an 80-year-old study. But thank you for mentioning it. I see it referred to all the time.
I also wonder if you might qualify for the long distance award coming
12 time zones away, yes. I'll gladly accept that.
There you go.
Yes, please.
Do you know what percentage of the population perished from the Black Plague in
It wasn't consistent. So you could have like one area 90% dying. You could have as low as 10%, or some neighborhoods in Milan escaping completely, and people work on that for areas where you've got, death records and so on. So that's really, people do these kinds of micro studies. People talk about the population of Europe declining about a third in the 100 years or so, following the beginning of the Black Death. I talked about the rise of the Khanate of Kazan and so on. So I'm really wondering if, in the Crimea in the 1430s, and over there also in the 1430s, 1440s, and I just wonder if that was just the first hint of the beginning of a population rebound, where they, for the first time in 70 years or 80 years or 100 years, they would have enough population rebounding to have functional states again. And so for certain areas, so the first thing is, yes, people talk about, let's say, a decline of at least a third of the population. And then I look in this area, and I've always wondered, how is it that certain of the ethnic groups there seem to have been totally wiped out? And so it may be that in some areas it was maybe far greater than a third, or far greater than 50%, or far greater than 70%. The mechanism never made sense, but this year suddenly people are talking about the second strain developing into the third strain, and maybe that's the mechanism for explaining why in some areas it really seems to have just totally wiped out the population. In fact, I have, in talking about this region for the 8th century to 9th century, I have some archaeologist colleagues, because I visit that region a lot, and they say that in this whole region, between, let's say around the 8th or 9th century, archaeologists talk about, in Russian they call it неkulturный слой, but so an uninhabited layer. So it seems that there are certain places where more or less there was total wipeout of the population after the plague in the time of Justinian. For the later period, I don't see that, but it could be a lot. But it's not consistent. Going once. Yes, sir.
Is the plague similar to Ebola in that some people acquire immunity, and then that's one of the reasons the plague died down for a while?
Certainly I'm not a medical doctor, and I read about the different theories about why. People are not sure, I guess, why in certain times, certain strain, or at certain times it seems to have killed more people, and at other times killed fewer people. It doesn't kill according to it doesn't kill people of all age groups equally, and so on. So that's one issue. Why is that? Is that because some people were exposed earlier, they survived, and then later on they didn't, or later on they continued to survive? Ebola is a whole other thing where there's a whole controversy. I thought, let's say, humanities can be political, But it turns out that biologists are such cutthroat competitors. You have the people who are the bacillus proponents who are locked in a death struggle with the virus proponents. So there are some people who will, stop at nothing to try to prove that Ebola, the virus, was responsible for the Black Death. So that's very, very contentious, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to explain it or comment deeply. But as far as I understand, the people I read or the people I work with are pretty content to say the DNA shows that it was a bacillus. Anything else? Going once, twice? Thank you very much.